They can call you Bill or even Billy, but you're my sweet William and you drive me silly. Oh, Will, you thrill me to my fingertips. William.
In the spring of 1956, a 15-year-old Janice Darlene Martin from Sutherland, Virginia, walked into a Nashville studio and cut a record for RCA Victor, the same label that had just signed Elvis Presley away from Sun Studio. The A-side was a flirty country rock number called Will You, William, written for her by staff songwriters in Richmond. On the flip side was a song she'd written herself, Drugstore Rock and Roll. The single sold hundreds of thousands of copies. One detailed history estimates around 750,000. And suddenly this Virginia teenager was on American Bandstand, The Tonight Show, and the Grand Ole Opry. RCA billed her as the female Elvis. On stage, she jumped, kicked, and swung her guitar in ways some critics thought were unseemly for a girl. And the label leaned into that too. For a brief moment, it looked like rock and roll was going to make room for a young woman, right alongside the men. To understand how she got there, you have to go back to a small Virginia town, a stage mother, and a child who could play guitar almost before she could ride a bike. Janice Darlene Martin was born March 27, 1940, in Sutherland, Virginia, a rural community near Danville. A History of Rock profile describes a family built for music. A mother who spent time on stage, and a father and uncle who were amateur musicians. In that house, a performing career wasn't a wild dream, it was almost expected. By the time she was 5, Janice was already playing and singing. At 6, she'd mastered chords on a junior-sized guitar and was copying the smooth country sounds of Eddie Arnold and Hank Williams. Family and neighbors remembered a child who seemed almost born for the stage. The Library of Virginia notes that her mother pushed her into local talent contests, and that she won numerous contests before the age of 10. In a time when most girls in Southside Virginia were expected to grow into housewives or secretaries, Janice Martin's classroom was the living room, the front porch, and any stage she could get to in a 50-mile radius. By age 11, Janice was singing regularly on the WDVA barn dance out of Danville. A few years later, she was on Richmond's Old Dominion barn dance, one of the biggest live country shows in the nation, ranked just behind the Grand Ole Opry. She shared bills with Ernest Tubb, the Carter family, Sonny James, and Gene Shepard. In 1955, Janice Martin was still in school, but the world around her was changing. Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock had already exploded. Elvis Presley was shaking up the South on Sun Records and about to make the leap to RCA Victor. At WRVA in Richmond, Grayson Tex Carmen, Eddie Brown, and Carlisle Sleepy Brooks had written a playful country rock tune called Will You, William. They brought in their teenage discovery from Sutherland, Virginia to sing it live. The crowd response was loud enough that they cut a demo tape from the broadcast and mailed it to their New York publisher, who in turn sent it to Steve Scholes, head of country and pop A&R at RCA Victor, the man who had just signed Elvis. Within weeks, he had arranged for Janice and her parents to come to Nashville and try recording for the label. In March 1956, Janice Martin cut her first session for RCA. On one side of the planned single was Will You, William, the song Scholes had heard from the barn dance. On the other was a tune Janice had written herself after hanging out at the local soda fountain, watching kids feed nickels into a jukebox. Drugstore Rock and Roll. When Scholes heard it, he decided to put it on the B-side, a 15-year-old girl's own take on the new sound. On jukeboxes and regional radio, the B-side stood out too. Drugstore Rock and Roll sounded looser, more rocking, with Janis pushing her voice over a slapping backbeat in a way that put her closer to Elvis and Gene Vincent than to the Nashville girl singers of the day. RCA had just spent heavily to sign Elvis Presley away from Sun. When Janis's record began to move, the label saw an angle: promote her as a kind of female counterpart to their new star. Press and trade ads started using the phrase, "the female Elvis," a tag that seems to have been encouraged by the label, and by some accounts not discouraged by Elvis's own manager, Tom Parker. On stage, she leaned into it. Film and photo stills from 1956 and 57 showed Janis bouncing, kicking, and working the mic stand with an energy rarely seen from women in country or pop at the time. One later writer put it simply: she didn't just sing like the boys, she moved like them. For that brief, bright moment, the path ahead seemed clear. The girl from Sutherland was going to be one of rock and roll's first female stars. In 1956, Billboard named her Most Promising Female Vocalist, putting a 15-year-old from Sutherland in the trade papers alongside established Nashville acts. At first, Janis accepted the tag of being the female Elvis, but she later admitted that she didn't like it. In a Nashville Scene interview, she said, "I think the female Elvis bit was a hindrance. The audience expected a bit of hip gyrations like he did, and I got tired of being called vulgar. It put a lot of pressure on me." Some fans loved the wildness. Others, especially young women who were themselves in love with Elvis, resented her. One rockabilly history notes that many girls disliked seeing someone else billed with his name, and that Janis's delivery and rough and ready stage moves struck some adults as vulgar. Even as the nickname opened doors, it narrowed the space she was allowed to stand in. Behind the image the label was selling, Janis Martin was living a very different story. On January 7, 1956, weeks before she signed with RCA, she eloped with her boyfriend, a paratrooper. She was 15. According to later accounts collected in biographies, she didn't tell her parents until after her new husband had shipped out to Germany. Her father tried to have the marriage annulled because of her age, but the effort stalled, and the union stood. Janis's family knew about the marriage. RCA did not. Her mother, who had pushed her onto stages since childhood, ordered her to keep the marriage secret to safeguard her career. From that point on, the girl the public saw as a single flirtatious teen idol was actually a married army wife, trying to keep two incompatible identities from crashing into each other. Her male peers, Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Gene Vincent, could all flirt freely on stage and off, and the industry tended to look away. For Janis, a teenage wife, the rules were different. One exposed secret could turn a rising star into a cautionary tale. Her husband, still stationed in Germany, got a 30-day leave and joined her on the road. Both the history of rock and multiple later profiles note what happened next with a kind of blunt understatement. The result was that the 17-year-old rockabilly star became pregnant. When she came home, the secret couldn't be hidden. Her family knew, management knew, eventually RCA knew that their teenage female Elvis, the one they'd been selling as a fresh-faced, unattached idol, was a married, pregnant 17-year-old. After the pregnancy was revealed, RCA continued to record her for a short while, but with little promotion. By early 1958, after one last session that produced the fierce single Bang Bang, the label canceled her contract. Not because the records had stopped rocking, but because her real life had broken rules that only seemed to apply to women. To make matters worse, Janis's marriage to the paratrooper she'd eloped with didn't last. After her daughter was born and RCA was gone, the relationship eventually collapsed, and she divorced. She remarried in 1960, In an interview later quoted in several retrospectives, Janis said that her second husband put his foot down about her singing career. She had been leading her own band around Virginia and the Carolinas, but at his insistence, she broke up the group and stepped away from professional music. For the next decade, she focused on her family, her home, and local life in Virginia. The Library of Virginia notes that Janis worked in a furniture store and later for the Danville Police Department, helping support her household. She raised her children, sang in church, and occasionally performed at local events. But there were no more national TV spots, no label showcases, and no attempts to chase the charts. Rock and roll history centered on Elvis and the men of Sun Records. When women showed up, they were often framed as novelty acts or briefly mentioned in sidebars. Janis Martin, once billed as the female Elvis and Billboard's most promising female artist, had effectively become a former teen star turned small-town working mom. But the records she made as a teenager outlived the career that birthed them. By the early 1970s, collectors and young rockabilly fans in Europe were digging through old catalogs, trading tapes, and arguing over the best Janis Martin sides. In an interview later reprinted in Rockabilly Central, she said that after her second marriage ended in the early 1970s, she decided to put a band together for the first time on her own terms, with no one telling her what to do. She called the group The Variations. She said, "When I got the band together in the 70s, I realized it wasn't Mama pushing me any longer. I hadn't realized how much I missed it and loved it." This time she wasn't chasing the charts, she was chasing the feeling. It was in the mid-70s that Janis drove to Nashville to visit an old ally, Chet Atkins, the guitarist and producer who had been in the control room for her very first RCA sessions. Atkins gave her unexpected news. He said, "Keep doing what you're doing, because this rockabilly revival is hitting like the devil over in England." By 1979, the invitations had become impossible to ignore. Ed Bays began lining up European dates, and as she later told writer Randy Fox, she could hardly believe there was an audience waiting for her overseas. She's quoted as saying, "It can't be. It can't be." It took her a few years to work up the nerve. Then, on her 42nd birthday, the same age that Elvis would pass away, she walked on stage in England for the first time. Throughout the early 1980s, Janis Martin toured Europe and the United States as part of the Rockabilly Revival, appearing at festivals and club shows where her name finally drew the kind of reverence that had eluded her in the 50s. For a new generation of musicians, especially women, those records were a revelation, and younger artists like Rosie Flores pointed to her as a direct influence. By the end of the 90s, her present was being documented alongside her past. A live show from the European circuit was captured and released as Here I Am on Hydra Records. A raw, unfussy document of Janis in full command of a stage again, decades after RCA had walked away. In 1995, a Texas-born guitarist and singer named Rosie Flores released an album on Hi-Tone called Rockabilly Philly. It was both a love letter and a history lesson, featuring guest vocals by two of her heroes, Wanda Jackson and Janis Martin. For Janis, the session was more than a guest spot. It was a public acknowledgement from a younger artist, from a respected indie label, and from critics, that she didn't just belong in 1950s nostalgia bins. She belonged in the living lineage of American roots music. Rosie Flores later said that hearing Janis's voice in the studio was a shock. It was older, yes, but seasoned, powerful, and still utterly distinct. She came away thinking, we have to get Janis back in the studio for a record. Over the next decade, she kept that idea alive.
Told you I'm a dirty old broad. All right, listen to it now. You're crazy about love and crazy about love myself. You know I'm crazy about love and I'm crazy about love myself. When you baby can't think about loving now. I've seen so many men like looking through a fine tooth comb. I've seen so many men like looking through a fine tooth comb. But these cats will make a good girl lose her home.
In 2007, she made it happen. Rosie Flores brought Janis Martin to a small studio in Blanco, Texas, with drummer Bobby Trimble co-producing. It would become Janis's first solo studio album in almost 30 years. And though nobody knew it, it would become her last. They picked a set of songs that nodded to her roots but didn't try to freeze her in 1956. Raucous rockers like Wham Bam Jam, juke joint shuffles like Roll Around Rockin'. In just 2 days, they cut 11 tracks. Reviewers would later marvel at how present Janis sounded. As one critic wrote, "The Blanco Sessions reveals that Martin still had chops. This ain't no retro record made to sound like back then." The sessions in Blanco felt like a new beginning. In reality, they were an ending. The Blanco, Texas tracks were finished in 2007, but on September 3rd, 2007, Janis Martin died of cancer, specifically lung cancer. She was 67 years old. That same year, in January 2007, her only son, Kevin Parton, had also died, a blow that friends say weighed heavily on her final months. The album they'd cut in Blanco was finished, but it wasn't released. Flores and Trimble shopped it to labels and got polite rejections. For a while, the track sat on shelves, existing mostly as stories Rosie Flores told in interviews. But she refused to let the music vanish. When traditional labels passed, she turned to something new: crowdfunding. Biographies and Rosie's own accounts say she raised over $16,000 on Kickstarter to get the record mixed, mastered, and released properly. On September 18, 2012, 5 years after Janis's death, Cow Island Music issued Janis Martin, The Blanco Sessions. The Austin Chronicle and others talked about the vitality in her voice, the sense that this wasn't a museum piece, but a living, breathing rock and roll record. In the years after her death, honors began to catch up. In 2010, the Library of Virginia named her one of its Virginia Women in History, citing both her early innovations and her later revival. A teenage female Elvis dropped for breaking the era's rules, a small-town working mother who managed a country club and played locally, and finally an artist rediscovered by international fans who heard in her voice something that never fit neatly into the boxes the 1950s tried to build. From drugstore rock and roll to the Blanco Sessions, you hear something simple and hard to market. A woman who loved rock and roll enough to come back to it twice, even after it let her go.
I'll trade you my heart for your heart, baby, give you all my kisses to boot. I'll trade you my heart for your heart, baby, give you all my kisses to boot. So if you feel you'd like to make a deal, cock your pistol and root